karanasan mo po, tingnan ba namin sa lahat ng dito?
Media educators and journalists called to defend press freedom.
This corruption in media won't be reduced to
You're watching News Cafe on the Solar News Channel. We're now joined by one of the country's most recognizable women today. She's a leading and staunch advocate of human rights. She was a House representative under the Akbayan Party since 1998 and is now the head of the Commission on Human Rights. She is Chairperson Etta Rosales. Ma'am, thanks again for joining us this afternoon on this taping of our program, News Cafe. We're here to talk about basically the Human Rights Reparation and Recognition Act of 2013. Can you tell us what it's all about?
Well, it's a bill that should have been passed something like 14 years ago. It was filed way back in 1995 by Congressman Edson Lagman and then by me in 1998 when I first entered Congress as a representative of Akbayan. And in a way, it is a bill that hopes to give compensation to victims of human rights violations under the Marcos regime. And in a way, it's an expression of government's accountability before they had this agreement between the Swiss government and the Philippine government that all money collected by the Swiss government that was going to be given to the victims, to the Philippine government, had to be transferred. This was way back in 1997 in a Supreme Court decision by the Swiss Federal Supreme Court on two conditions. One was they had to prove that the money was ill-gotten through due process.
Yes.
And then the second was that a fair share of the money should be given to victims of human rights violations. So the first part was actually realized in 2003, July 15, when the Corte Suprema ruled that the money, that was about $500 plus million that was transferred from the Swiss dummy foundations of Marcos to the Philippine government, was able to prove that the money was ill-gotten. Henceforth, the money had to be, a fair share had to be given to the victims of human rights violations. Now, this bill passed into law is an expression of that commitment.
This is the first time that martial law has been recognized as for what it is, no?
Yes.
And the victims of martial law have been
Yes,
recognized as
yes.
real victims and true victims of abuse.
Yes.
And why did it take so long?
Well, maybe you should ask the guys who were running the government before. Why did it take so long? I guess it's because the People's Uprising, way back in 1986, which aspired for the restoration of democracy, freedom, and justice by the Filipino people, supported by the international solidarity, was a breakthrough, you know. I mean, everybody really praised the Filipino people for that achievement. We stopped the tanks from going through at that time, yeah? Now, the Philippine Constitution legalized this aspiration. It had agrarian reform, it had human rights, and much. We have one of the richest constitutions on human rights, not just civil and political rights, but also economic, social, and cultural rights. No? So that was that. Everything was in place, at least legally, in the Constitution. Then subsequent to that, framers of the people who had marched down the streets, who were elected into office in the House of Representatives and in the Senate, started working for human rights laws against all the atrocities that were committed by Marcos. So that's when we started to file a bill against human rights, the atrocities of Marcos. Then we also had the anti-torture law. I was an author of that myself. And then the anti-enforced disappearance. And then, of course, extrajudicial killings and so on and so forth. No? So all of these bills were filed precisely to articulate the position of government that in fact the Constitution should come out in statutes. The human rights policies should come out in statutes. Now, why did it take so long? I guess it's because people in government, a lot of them were allies of Marcos, and it was difficult to legislate these bills into law. There was a lot of resistance. You talk about the Northern Alliance, for instance, and then the Marcoses themselves were not really, they were able to get themselves elected into office.
Yes.
Yeah, in the House of Representatives. Now,
Right.
of course, Bongbong Marcos is in the Senate.
Yeah. What happens now, ma'am? Now that it is an act, what's the next step? How will the victims be compensated?
Okay, the victims will be compensated through a point system according to the law. Well, actually, it's been ratified. We're just waiting for the signature of the president. And I'm keeping my fingers crossed that somehow, at least within February, he'll have a chance to be able to do this.
Before the anniversary of the revolution?
Before the EDSA Revolution anniversary, or maybe even during the EDSA Revolution anniversary.
Okay.
That would really be very significant. Now, after that, after the bill becomes operational, you go through the IRR first.
Yes.
No? And when it becomes operational, I think 6 months are given for the victims of human rights violations to file their claims. So that as early as now, and even yesterday, we have already been receiving a lot of letters from claimants in the office, in the Commission on Human Rights, to try to find out if they would have a chance of coming here and so on and so forth.
And how do you know if a person is a bona fide claimant?
Well, very simply, I mean, they tried to make it as simple as possible. You don't have to have your birth certificate, you don't have to have a lot of things, but you have to show through a narrative, through an affidavit, through a newspaper clipping, through somebody who knew you, as simple as possible, that you are a bona fide claimant. Because most of the claimants were people who probably did not have, birth certificates hidden in their closet, So they're people who come from the lower income bracket, they're indigenous peoples, they're ethnic minorities, the Muslims, they're farmers, workers, urban poor, then students, and of course teachers and quite some professional groups, no? Like Senator Sergio Osmeña, of course, is a member of Claimants 1081, I mean, that sort of thing.
Yes.
Or Joel Lamangan, the famous director, no?
Yes.
Yeah. But these are few in number compared to the
many.
to the many.
The faceless and nameless who
faceless,
suffered
yes.
during martial law.
Yes.
And how long before they get paid?
We're actually given 2 years to be able, the bill, once it's signed into law, it gives it about 2 years for the board, a board of claimants, of claims rather, will be elected. There will be a selection committee, or a nomination committee rather,
Okay.
and they'll nominate, they'll nominate, and then I think the president will come up with his own selection of who should be members of the board. And the board of claims will probably work for 2 years and should be able to finish everything within 2 years to work out,
And the funding is there, ma'am.
The funding is there. It's funny, but ever since I filed the bill, and of course there were the reasons of government why they never calendared. We actually had finished, by the time I ended my term, which was 2007, we had actually finished our BICAM. And si Joker was on the other side. Etta, ministerial na yan, wala yung problema. Matatapos na ito, batas na ito. Diba? So they had it ratified in the Senate, pero in the House, they did not have it calendared for ratification. It was so malicious, it was so wrong, because you're not supposed to obstruct. Ministerial na yan eh. Nonetheless, yun
Dapat
ang
tuloy-tuloy
nangyari.
na yun.
Dapat tuloy-tuloy na yun. Dapat tuloy-tuloy na yun. And even if the President doesn't sign it, once it's ratified by Congress, batas na yan after a while, di ba?
Yeah.
Pero hindi niya sinainan for her own reasons. Ayaw na sabihin ko ano yun. Maybe she didn't like me. But nonetheless, after a while, I mean, the truth of the matter was that the money was kept intact, 10 billion pesos.
Okay.
And to show you that the government, did not do any hanky-panky about the money, it earned interest, and the interest is to the tune of 500 million pesos now.
Okay.
Yeah, and that 500 million pesos, the 10 billion pesos goes to the victims, and the 500 million pesos goes to a museum, memorialization, library, the works, to try to overhaul the entire educational system specific to martial law, and to try to bring out the truth about martial law, the stories of heroism and martyrdom by the people who fought the dictatorship, and so on and so forth.
Tell us about being a survivor of martial law.
Well, here I am. I survived it. It was torture. I was a torture victim, but torture victims, there were those who were actually tortured much, much worse than I. But it hurt enough, as it were, because they put me in a, what they call euphemistically as a safe house. Mm-hmm. It's a torture chamber. They put all the victims that they arrest there. And I think it was in Pasig. They occupy a building there. And then they put me there, and yung piniringan, blindfolded me.
Blindfolded.
Tapos they wanted me to drink beer, pero ayoko kasi yun. Then, yun. They started torturing already. Una, they burned me with wax, candle wax, So, it's funny because I said, ouch. Hindi ko makalimutan to, The funny things while you're being tortured, it sticks in your mind. So I kept on saying, ouch. Galit yung mga torturers, yung masang masundalo yan. Anong klaseng ouch? Bakit pa-English ka pa? Dapat aray. Yun, mga ganyan, Tapos yung isa, while I was being tortured, sabi nung sundalo, nung ahente na nagtutorture, yan ang nakuha mo kasi binagsak mo ako. Estudyante ko pala. Mga ahente, mga estudyante, binagsak ko, siguro hindi nag-aaral. Yan ang nakuha mo. I remember those things. Kasi buhay na buhay. And then I tried to pretend I was dying already. Kasi para tumigil na, kasi masakit masyado. Pero alam nila ang endurance mo. So they will just keep on torturing you. They sexual molestation. And then the electric shock. The electric shock was terrible. The whole body. Kukuryentehin ka, tapos walang tigil, tapos they increase the what do you call this?
The voltage.
The voltage. Pag hindi nila gusto ang sagot mo, pasasakitin pa nila, yung gano'n. Then also, it's a modified water cure, I guess. It's a dish rag that they put with water, so you're suffocated, and you can't breathe. So
and
I pretended I was dying.
This was organized, ma'am.
Oh, yeah.
It was part of the system.
Of course, it's part of the system. But they will never write it down as policy. But it was what? Ayun. And
How pervasive was it under Marcos?
Pervasive as everybody who was caught and whom
Was
they
tortured.
considered as subversive, in that sense, was tortured.
And this went on all across the country.
Oh, yeah.
In many, many safe
Oh,
houses.
yes.
And thousands were tortured.
Yes,
and killed.
I would imagine. And killed. I mean, you had the case of Hilao. She was, I don't know, she was raped or what, but she died. A number of people died in the cell. Diba? Tapos mawawala na lamang. Ganon. It was terrible.
How about the people who died? Some of their families have never found them.
Oh, the enforced disappearance and
Yes.
then summary killings, yes. So the next of kin would be the actually claimants.
The actual
So
claimants and
enforced
beneficiaries.
and beneficiaries. And we have already passed the bill, the Anti-Disappearance, Anti-Enforcement Act, under Noynoy Aquino, just
Okay.
a few days ago, yeah.
Well, let's talk about that, ma'am. We still have a lot to talk about. More on those when News Cafe returns after this short break. You're still watching News Cafe on the Solar News Channel, and we're still joined by CHR Chairperson, our special guest, Etta Rosales. Ma'am, thanks again for joining us. Let's talk about the forced disappearances. The bill was passed. I've been wondering while we were talking in the first gap, how are you and the Marcoses?
Well, civilized in the way we relate to each other. Aimee, for instance, was my colleague in the House of Representatives from the 11th to the 13th Congress. And some of my bills, she also had her own bills with a very similar party list system, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes.
No? But when it came to the compensation bill, of course she didn't like it. She's the daughter.
Yes.
I don't blame her. And she told me that she didn't like the bill at all and she didn't agree with it. So I said, well, let's just debate on the floor. But every time we would discuss the bill, she'd go to her room. So she
So she never debated with you
She never
on the
debated
bill
it.
at
Then
all?
she told me, I will just come up with my own manifestation at the end after the bill is, passed on third reading. And I said, of course, I mean, that's your
Did she?
option. But she was not able to anymore. No, not anymore. I mean, it was just like she was no longer, she wasn't able to give her manifestation.
Do you think, ma'am, that that can happen again, martial law in this country?
Of course, I mean, you can't say that it won't. But I think that it will be much more difficult. I mean, legally in the Constitution,
Yeah.
they've made it much more difficult for martial law to be imposed. And there's a limitation. I mean, you have to report right away, and then there's a
Right.
fine. If you obey the law, of course.
If you obey the law.
If you
but
obey the law. But if
the
you...
armed forces,
you know,
for example,
Exactly. I mean, ganun lang naman
takes
yun
over,
eh.
oo.
Diba? If the military takes over, the might makes right, and that's your power, so it could happen. It could always happen. That is why it really depends upon the coming together of the people, the critical mass who are interested in democracy, justice, freedom, and so on, both in and out of government.
do you think where we are now in our democracy calls for something like that o malayong mangyari?
Yung martial law,
Oo.
malayo. Malayong-malayo. Under the President, Noynoy, malayo, because we engaged the military. The military and the police are actually engaged in, we have the security reforms. We have a declaration, we call it Labresa Declaration, where we're coming in with common programs of cooperation and exchange of, what do you call this, these complaints against them. I'd like to do some analysis on case studies with respect to, like excessive use of force, violations against the rule of law, violations against rules of engagement, and this sort of thing. And they're open. Especially the Chief of Staff right now, General Manny Bautista. He was the one who authored the IPSP. This is the Internal Peace and Security Plan of government. And essentially, it means 90% political solution to internal armed conflict, 10% military only when necessary. So that's the essence of that manual.
What about teaching the young of what martial law was, para hindi na maulit? So people know what martial law really was. And dami hindi nakakaalam what martial law was, how terrible it was and how horrible it was, and how it took advantage of the country and of the people.
Yeah, that's true. And right now, the people the children don't really know, no? And they think, many of them consider Marcos a great man because that's how he is projected.
Portrayed.
Yeah, and that's how he's portrayed. But that's the advantage of the law, because this is 500 million pesos that you can convert into a museum. And, we have the martial law files. The martial law files project seeks to try and get declassified martial law documents from the security sector, from maybe whatever sources, Malacanang, the schools, etc., and digitize them so that you can bring them to the public for information, for instruction, for education.
What about the curriculum in schools?
That's part of the law. Isn't that nice? Because the law provides for the Commission on Human Rights to take the lead, and all other institutions involved, to get the CHED and the DepEd to come together, sit down, and to find out how we can, in fact, review, the history specific to the martial law regime, and help enrich it with the true, truth or data that have been hidden from us for quite some time.
And how long, ma'am, before this is implemented in schools?
Well, it will probably take a little more time. But as early as now, we can start. We've started to convening and talking to the National Archives, for instance, has met with us, and I was so happy. They were enthusiastic. They were interested. Then the Philippine Historical Commission, National Historical Commission by Maris Diokno heads this thing. So I think that if we start talking to them as early as now, just to make the preparations and get everybody on board, to read the bill, the law, and finally to find out how we can do this, it may take longer with respect to a structured formal curriculum, that is put in place. But that is not to stop us from coming out with YouTube, for instance.
Right.
The young kids are doing it now. The National Youth Commission came out with very interesting, studies of YouTube, through the YouTube, of values of democracy, freedom, justice, and then also against martial law. And then there's a website here that tells the story of young martyrs and people who fought the dictatorship. It's now in the Commission on Human Rights. There's a website, and we can look into that. And so right now it can, we can start it, and then the social network, of course, can look into this and take initiative in discussing all of these things.
The declassified documents, ma'am, do you have them in your possession at this point?
There are some of them, but they're not. Let's put it very politely. It seems like the intelligence is so shy to share their documents. But the National
the more
Defense,
substantial documents.
Yes, but the National Defense Secretary, Gasmin, was saying, ilabas na yan, para let's start it off already, because let's start with a clean slate. So, sige ma'am, gagawin namin. And some of the agencies of government are interested in doing this already. So, it may take a little time, but that's attitudinal, the habits that they have developed, and syempre their values. It's difficult, but they're opening up slowly. With the cooperation of people up there, then maybe we can get, ISAP and all the other agencies, intelligence agencies, to cooperate.
In terms of human rights, ma'am, how do we stand as a country today?
We are, in Asia, you'd say that we are among the lead countries that have actually become a state party to the 9 core human rights instruments. There are 9 core human rights instruments. We actually have 8 already. We're a state party to 8 treaties. So that's telling a lot. Maybe we're the leading organization, country with respect to that. The good news, the UPR, this is the Universal Periodic Review. We have joined them, and we have, out of 88 recommendations by the UN Human Rights Council, we have actually adopted 65, and under the DOJ, we are going to try to implement the recommendations by the UN Human Rights Council. This involves putting an end to impunity, extrajudicial killings, and forced disappearances, blah, 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 and strengthening the Commission on Human Rights several times over. All of these things are now being addressed. In terms of actual practice, there's a slowness in the way that the security forces are doing this, because there's still a lot of killings ongoing. And just the other day, I got this text again from Basilan. Was it Basilan de Zamboanga? Somebody was abducted, especially the Muslims. It's so easy to abduct the Muslims. It's so easy to kill the indigenous peoples, communities. So we have difficulty in that. And the difficulty is compounded by the fact that, national development policies invite foreign investment. And a lot of this foreign investment go into extractive industry. And extractive industry goes into these big mining corporations. And this big mining corporation, even if they're just given, not yet given the permit to explore and so on, already trample upon the rights of the villagers, the IPs, and so on and so forth. So we need to have human rights, impact assessment to look into the matter and to remind government that, in fact, they should be complying with what has been agreed upon between us and the international treaties to whom we are a party. This is, I'm talking about the International Covenant for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, where we protect our natural resources, our biodiversity, our fauna, our flora, this sort of thing. But all of these are being violated precisely when you've got big mining corporations that get in the way. So that's a big challenge for us.
Is enforcement supported by the judicial system?
We have we have a very big problems with the flawed criminal justice system. Efforts are being made, but it takes much, much more. I would think that when you look at the three branches of government, the one that needs all the help to recover is the criminal justice system. And that's the reason why we've got congested,
Congested jails.
jails. And when you have congested jails, torture, dehumanized conditions, diseases, and being, dying in the jail becomes a common thing, and it's not being monitored properly. That is something that we should be monitoring. There are a lot of problems with respect to that. So it is really strengthening the institutions but not just strengthening the institutions as it were, but by implementing, a lot of laws human rights laws that we have actually adopted.
And for us in media, what should we be looking out for in terms of the Human Rights Reparation and Recognition Act?
Well, the monitoring by media is terrific. We should at least, the laws for instance, the media should know the laws. Because when the media knows the laws, then the media will know when violations are being committed. And then they come to me, and then we work together. And then we do whatever we have to do. I would hope that there should be less sensationalism with respect to media. Media, they report, the killings, whatever, violence. I think that media should try to be more focused on implementation of laws that are important on questions of human rights and international humanitarian law. And that necessitates education on the part of media also. Yeah.
Cool, ma'am. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for your time. It
Thank
was
you.
30 minutes flew by really, really fast.
Yeah.
We hope you can join us again in the future.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have. We would like to thank our guest, of course, Chairperson Etta Rosales, for joining us in a special one-on-one interview. Join us again next Friday for another 360-degree discussion right here on News Cafe. Salamat po.
Sa bukod, kung ba nakasalanan ng dito.
Media educators and journalists call to defend press freedom.